Hi everyone and welcome. We're down here in my wormery and you can see a few things I've got laid out on the table here. One of them is just a variety of different foods, and in this bag I've got certain little special items put aside. I've got a frozen banana that I cracked in half. I've got a whole bunch of cantaloupe rinds and a little splash of color, some strawberry leaves. And it's with these sweet fruity items that I plan to reload my bait bombs. Now, the bait bombs come into play in my two finishing tubs that are up here on the top shelf, the ones with no labels on them. And in the past I've used these little containers, which are really just enclosures for the filter, two filters that can run at once for my pond pump. The pond pump died, but these enclosures with these little openings in them seem to be the perfect thing to place bait food into, and maybe a little bit of fresh bedding. And we're going to place those into my two finishing tubs in order to try to lure worms out of the material. The older of the two tubs is now something in the neighborhood of 35 days old, I think, at least a month old now. And assuming that we had actually maybe ended up with some worm eggs in that material, that should have been enough time for those worm eggs to eventually hatch. And hopefully we're going to end up with some baby worms in there. That doesn't necessarily mean that the baby worms are going to be easy to just round up. What we're trying to do is bring them to one particular location in the bin where we can scoop them out. Same story with the other bin, except that other bin's only been going for about a week and a half, not even 2 weeks, I believe. So if there are worm eggs in that one as well, then it's going to take a little bit more time, something in the neighborhood 3-4 weeks, maybe longer sometimes, for the eggs in those containers to hatch. But hopefully we'll be at the point soon that we can really call this a finished tub of compost after we've done a good effort to try to remove the worms that are still in it. Not to say that it's all that necessary. There'd be nothing wrong with just using this material as it is, and the worms ending up in your garden would actually probably be beneficial to your garden. But I like to try to keep my worms in my wormery and keep them working for me rather than being out in the garden. Although being out in the garden, they'd be working for me as well, so it doesn't matter so much. And then obviously once we've collected any worms that are in these bins, I'm going to need somewhere to put them. They're going to end up going into the newest of my bins down here in this light colored tub on the end. But as long as we're down here, I've also got some other food items in this bag right here to feed the other bins as well. Actually, all three of those bins down there are getting fed today. So the first thing though is going to be to also prepare our little collection of worms that we've been baiting out of these two tubs. I'll just put them in here as a temporary holding spot. Once we get this newest of my tubs up onto the table, we'll release whatever worms that we've collected. So let's start out by getting these tubs up onto the table and see who we can round up for some fun. Alright, so before we open up these tubs, start extracting the worms, I'd like to be prepared here with the bait bombs that we're creating. I've already started putting some stuff into them. It's basically just leaves that I've put in there, but I've got kind of almost an irresistible collection of food items for these little guys. So I'm just going to load these things up with this mix of different types of fruits: strawberry, cantaloupe, banana. So not only are they going to provide a delicious feast, they should also bring with them a fair amount of moisture too, which in itself will also draw the worms, I believe. Alright, so whatever didn't fit into here, we'll just include that with the feeding for the other tubs. I definitely prepared more than I needed of this stuff. So now we're ready to extract what's in there now and put these in its place. What's in there now is really nothing fancy. It's attempting to do the same thing, which is to bait the worms out of the material, but I didn't have any sort of a perforated container. It's just a little bit of food that I placed on top of the surface, in the hopes that it would, draw the worms close. Let's do these one at a time. We'll bring up our little collection tub into which we can place the worms that we collect. But I want to be quick about it because once the light starts shining on here, the worms are going to be repelled and want to dive down into the material. So I want to make my best effort to try to collect these guys quickly in order to, avoid having them escape my collection efforts here. So let's see how many we got on top of the plastic. Now on top of the material, we've got worms. I mean, they're out here for the picking. Easy collection. So I'm gonna just round them all up here. Oh, this one's almost over the edge. This little baby one. These two little tiny worms coming up out of the material. Actually, here's an even smaller one. Very small. Itsy bitsy, I would say. All right, these guys are really on the move. They don't like being out here in the bright light. So I think in addition to the worms themselves, I should probably cover them up with something if I could. I guess as I'm collecting the worms, I'll probably bring with them a certain amount of casting material that they can burrow into. Now under this newspaper is a coffee filter. And I think the coffee filter already had a few holes in it, but I think just from this past week that this has been out here, or maybe not even a whole week, maybe 6 days since we were in here last. Seems like the coffee filter has been pretty much chewed up almost completely. This piece of bread looks like it's also being worked on. There's a worm right on top of it, so they're not bothered by it. I'm always a little skeptical of the bread. I don't get the type of results I'm expecting with it usually. You always hear these stories about how a slice of bread on the top of your castings will draw out all the worms. Well, I don't think I've seen that yet. I've tried it a number of times, but I've not yet seen it. So it's under here that we would hope to find the greatest number of collected worms hanging out in the material. I guess this is probably some sort of a bedding that we had laid in here for them. I'm wondering if just the best bet here would be to simply collect this entire pile of castings. Ultimately, what I want to be left with in this container is just a bunch of nice, clean worm castings. So my aim here was to try to extract worms only here, but I believe plucking out a bunch of the castings that they're occupying is just a little bit of collateral damage, and it's not a big deal, so it's fine. I'm definitely observing here, though, in this material, the presence of a huge number of really itsy bitsy worms. Here and there we find a mature worm. The mature worms can be identified by having that little bulge on their body. Those are the ones that are old enough, ready to mate. But in this collection that we just scooped out of here, I believe the majority of what we're seeing are really small, tiny worms. One on the tip of my finger, two of them on the tip of my finger. Most of them just trying to squirm away, get out of the bright light, following their natural instincts. So I don't want to go too crazy pulling out all castings here. I did get quite a bit in the process here, but we can employ a little bit of a trick here. What we can do is kind of stack up the material a bit, give them a moment to work their way down out of the bright lights, and then hopefully at the end we can actually scoop back a little bit of the casting material that came out with the worms in the process here. So let's just collect up these last few items that were out here originally, trying to lure the attention of the worms into the feeding area. Not even a feeding area anymore as far as I'm concerned. I treat this more as kind of a baiting area. Technically I don't treat myself as actually feeding this bin anymore. The only purpose of the food here anymore is to try to coerce the worms out of the material. I guess as we work our way down, the moisture right beneath where the food had been most recently added and beneath where the plastic covering was located is where we're going to end up finding the greatest amount of moisture and, as a result of that, the most number of worms, trying to take advantage of that moisture. And you know, one thing you've sort of got to come to terms with when you're doing this is that it's very unlikely that you're ever going to really get all of the worms out of your castings. Chock full of worms. So after 35 days, I am starting to feel pretty confident that any worms that were going to be born in this material are hopefully born by now. Sometimes you have to sort of make some basic assumptions so that you can make your next steps. And it's probably a safe assumption at this point that any cocoons that were in this have most probably hatched out by now. At this point, it's really just allowing enough time for the worms to make their way out of the material over into the bait bomb that we're going to put in here for them. Tray's in the way, but when you start examining this material down in here, you will see that there's lots of worms in here, and they're all over the place. They're not really all focused in the feeding area. So I think that also tells us that, you know, there's a lot of material remaining in the bin. Here's a big chunk of cardboard. There's stuff all throughout this material that's going to make the worms feel completely comfortable and give them no reason to leave. The moisture is nice. There's scraps of food in here. So, you know, there's not much you can do. If you allow enough time, eventually they will deplete all of that. However, if you keep depleting the numbers by trying to extract them and relocate them, then, you know, there's fewer and fewer bodies remaining in the bin to do that job. So there is some sort of a balance point, I would assume, at some stage where you, you know, kind of call it quits and go with what you got. So let's just throw this little remainder of the food that we brought over with them aside. Because I guess the one last thing I'll do here to try to aid in the progress here is try to give this material a little bit of a spin, bring the more damp material up high, bring the more dry material that's been sitting out on the surface down lower, attempting to try to equalize the moisture level of the material within the bin. At the same time, it's a good chance to try to kind of break open larger chunks that are sort of stuck together due to moisture, all giving it an opportunity to air out a little bit, hopefully become a little bit more dry and crumbly. And not only will that allow for quicker drying, I think that it will also allow for easier movement of the worms through the material. So yeah, this bin definitely has a fair number of worms lingering in it. You know, at some point I just sort of make the call to say, hey, this is now a tub of finished compost. I could dump it all right in the garden if I want. I can try to extract the worms. And I think for fun, we usually take the option of trying to extract the worms. I mean, as wonderful as these worms would do out in my garden, I think one way or another, worms are making their way out in the garden by using the compost. I don't think we need to send so many of them out there, though. All these little workers are probably better off in my wormery, helping me to compost the next batch of kitchen scraps. Very nice material, and since I've already got my garden in the ground, I don't feel so anxious to, get the material from the worms and use it for my gardening. I think I've already got everything that I need to get this garden this year taken care of. So I'm not in a real rush to drive this finishing tub to completion. Although I would like to have the tub to start up a new, fresh environment. And I'd like to get the worms out of it as well to get them to work elsewhere. So let's grab one of these fancy bait bombs that we created here. And somewhere here in the middle, I guess, I'm going to position the container in such a way that hopefully the majority of it is submerged beneath the surface of the material, giving the worms easy access to come in through the holes on the side, or even to cruise right into the material from the top, whatever they prefer. Since a lot of worms do like to feed search for their next meal on the surface, giving them access from the top down into the bait material is a good idea. All right, we're looking pretty good here. I like the way this material looks. Still seeing a lot of worms though, so let's give this one a little bit more time. You know what? I got a little bit mixed up. This is the older of the two. This is the one that we're probably not going to expect to see too many worms in this one. This is the bin that's much newer. This is the one that's only been here for about 12 days. And I do know that when we harvested the castings, when we separated these castings from the worms that were doing the work previously, we definitely had a lot of worms remaining in this material. So okay, I'm sorry, I'm getting things a little bit confused. This is actually the one that's only been sitting for about 12 days. So it shouldn't be too surprising that we've still got a lot of worms in here, and a lot of potential for baby worms to still be hatched in here too. All right, we're going to use this old material that's well on the way already as sort of our covering. It's the stuff that was on the top already originally. We're just going to return it to the top where it was. But the worms that we collected will stay with us. Now maybe, like we said earlier, maybe we can scoop a little bit of this casting material off the top that's been kind of evacuated already here. The worms that were in this very top layer have probably gone down deeper to get out of the bright light. So we can try to recover some of this casting material and keep it with the tub of finished castings rather than move it over with the worms. Okay, very cool. All right, I'm going to get this thing covered up here again. This coffee filter is getting shredded. I think by placing it right here, we're probably not going to recognize it as a coffee filter next time we see it. And then this piece of paper was sort of doing a job covering the top, but the middle of it's been kind of chewed out already, so we'll try to fix it up in such a way that we can still get a little bit more use out of it, and at the same time create a little haven where the worms can hang out. They like coming down onto this paper over the feeding zone where the moisture collects, and we'll use that as an opportunity to try to bait some of the worms as well. Very good, not bad for 12 days of finishing. I was originally getting a little bit taken aback by the number of worms, because I wasn't expecting to see so many, because I thought we were in the other bin that's already been doing this for 35 days. So now we get to come over here and see what the story is with these guys. So in this one, alright, so now in this one we've got similar setup. Piece of plastic, a little bit smaller in this case, holding the moisture down over the center of the bin. Only one worm hanging out here on the top. I think if we attempt to lift off this paper here, we should be able to just let this little guy drop off. If we examine the back side, here's another little worm stuck to the back. We'll help them get back down into the container as well. So we can check in on this bin to see how it's doing. Similarly, we had set this piece of bread on top of the feeding area, and I guess I had maybe sprinkled some grit on here in the expectation that there'd be baby worms making their way over here and needing the grit, since they don't have any when they're born. So now here, the idea here would have been that this would be material that's hopefully occupied by a bunch of baby worms that have been making their way out of the material over time. But I'm seeing so few, really. I mean, I saw a couple here, but I didn't want to just do that wholesale scooping of castings just to grab one or two worms. It seemed like in this case it might be a little bit more sensible to do a little bit of a strategic sort of picking them off one by one approach. Admittedly, there's going to be a lot of little itsy bitsy worms that I'm probably not going to see very well. They are so tiny and they blend in so well. But it's usually like times like this when I start to question if I've given this material maybe enough time already to get depopulated. You know, a lot of these worms are still very juvenile. They're not really developed yet where they've got that bulge on their bodies, which is an indication of maturity, that they're old enough to breed at that point. These are still small baby worms that aren't even old enough to breed yet. Guess the one last thing I'm going to try to do here is just go down a little bit deeper, just to see what I can see. Sometimes the very bottom, where the most damp material and the coolest environment is where you're going to end up seeing the greatest number of worms. And I believe that by going a little bit deeper, we've actually unearthed a couple more worms, a couple little pockets where we're finding additional worms, but certainly not many at all. Not like the other bin. 35 days is a fair amount of time to have given this material to let it evacuate. But like I said, I'm not in a real hurry to collect these castings quite yet. So I think what I'll do is I'll give this material a little bit more time, just to let the last few straggler worms make their way to this delicious box that we prepared for them. The other one that we made for them is right here, ready to go. Be a shame not to use it. So we'll do it the same exact way. We'll create a little bit of a hole for them to be drawn to, as well. We'll place the bait in there. But you know what? Before we do that, let me give this entire bin a little bit of a stir up like we did before for the other bin too. The material, when it dries out, it becomes really stiff and hard. So I like to get it down a little bit if it's dry, and bring it up if it's damp, to let it air out. At the same time, we get to do a little bit of an inspection too. But as I might work my way around, I'm really not coming across any sort of stashes of large worm populations. Here and there I stumble on one, but nothing that's telling me that we've got some sort of a pocket of really cozy material that we're going to find a whole bunch of worms in. I think just to the contrary, as a matter of fact, anything that might have been a little bit more damp, a little bit more sticky and moist like this, we're using this as an opportunity to break it up, get some air pockets in there, give the material a chance to air out a little bit, and at the same time maybe make it a little bit less appealing for the worms to hang out in. All right, I'm going to start making the hole here for the bait box. Once again, we're going to position it in such a way that we can backfill it almost right up to the rim, or right up to the rim. This piece of bread that they'd already been introduced 6 days ago. Let them continue work on that. Really nice material in this tub. I can hardly wait to harvest it after 35 days. There'd certainly be no reason you couldn't just grab this stuff and use it as is. But since we've got time, we're not in a big hurry, we're going to go ahead and deploy one last bait bomb on this one. And maybe once that one has been left to go for another week or so, we'll pull out any last worms that we can, and we'll get them relocated, but then this bin will be done, I believe. We're definitely close enough to that point that I think we can make that call. So let's get this thing covered back up here. Got ourselves a straggler worm here. We'll be just fine right there. Hopefully they can find the bait bomb easy enough. Now, we've got some worms here, but not too many. We'll get these guys cut loose into the newest of my bins. So let me clean up here. I'll put these finishing tubs aside and we'll get to feeding. So the bin we're beginning with is the newest of my bins. It's not old at all. I believe this is either its 5th or 6th feeding. That's if you count the food that was loaded into the bin when it was originally built. Right away we're getting a little peek at some of the inhabitants of the bin. Just want to make sure none of them catch a ride on this plastic since it's going to get really dry. When I reviewed the video from last week, when we had a chance to see these red wigglers on the top surface before I evicted them, it looked to me like some of them had a really prominent bulge, like that guy right there, or this one right here, as a matter of fact. It's those that I believe are on the verge of laying a cocoon when that bulge gets really prominent and large, like right there. Although I don't know. I mean, I'm definitely no expert. Sometimes I don't even really take a really close look at the worms as an individual. I prefer to look at them as kind of a colony almost, or a mass. I kind of like that mob mentality, watching them all pile up on a piece of food and gobble it up. Or when they congregate together, squirm around against each other. Those are the sort of things that I get a kick out of, playing around with my worms. But sometimes I try to take a closer look at what individual worms are doing. And in the case right here, I believe, you could see two worms that are, they appear to be kind of interlocked with one another, right? I don't want to, they'll probably disconnect as a result of me probing around here, but like this little guy right here and this one right here connected to each other right around here somewhere in the midsection. Those two worms are mating. I always feel a little bad disrupting that activity, but just by having opened up the bin, I already feel like I've disrupted it. I believe they're already well aware of my presence and they're aware of the really bright light overhead, so they're probably redirecting their priority towards self-preservation as opposed to procreation. A lot of these pieces of paper that we're encountering here as we work our way down into the feeding zone is right down here in the middle. These are all pieces of paper that probably at one point served the purpose of covering up the entire bin. They were probably full sheets of newspaper at one point. They're looking like they went through a shredder. Maybe before we release the little worms that we collected here, maybe we'll just get the fresh food into here, get things leveled off, and then we'll plop those guys in and release them. Right now they're good where they are. I don't want to disturb them unnecessarily, so they're in store for one more relocation, and let it just be one thing. Let's not relocate them and then also have to push and prod them around to make room for their next feeding. All right away we can see signs of the previous feeding in here. This looks like a banana peel. This really moldy stuff has got to be the bread with some cardboard bits attached to it. Here's a banana stem. But everything's coming along really nicely. Everything's got a nice gooiness to it, which usually means that it's already definitely been infiltrated by bacteria, mold, all those little things that really get the head start on the food before the worms can get at it. So those are always very good signs that the material is breaking down to the point where the worms can come in and start slurping it up. Peach pit. Usually not much to see with the peach pit. Okay, plenty of cardboard bedding down in here. All kinds of bits of cardboard bedding. But I did come prepared today to add more bedding. So I've got this container full of shredded up egg carton. So I'm just going to drop in enough to be a nice little lower layer that we can rest our new feeding on top of. Start placing these food items back out here. Banana peel, peach pit, bread, and whatnot. Since they seem to be doing such a great job breaking down what we've been giving them, we'll do the 2 handful dosage like we did last time. That right there was handful number 1. Here we have handful number 2. I believe they received a similar amount of this last time, and they appear to have done a pretty good job eating it all up. There's always going to be that banana stem or some sort of a harder, slower composting item that's going to require a little bit more time to get broken down by the worms, but they've done a good job depleting everything that I gave them last time, or making a pretty good effort at it. So in goes the next feeding. Besides, I'm running out of room in my refrigerator. Once in a while it seems like, oh my goodness, I have nothing to give the worms. Then other times it seems like, oh my goodness, I have so much stuff set aside for the worms. I'm running out of room in the freezer. And we've also got these little scraps of paper that I think are also great things to place right over the feeding zone too. That's where all the activity is, and these little pieces of paper seem to be where the worms come to pick up some of that moisture that collects on it. Without any further ado, we're introducing these little guys back to their old aunts and uncles from who knows back when. Remember these guys? Maybe not. Some of these might be newborns. Either way, this is their new home. Let's see if we can get a sense of how many it is that we actually ended up baiting out of those 2 finishing tubs. What do you say? A couple hundred at least, no? Quite a few little ones too. Plenty of them have, you know, the bulge on them, so they do look like they're mature enough, but then there's also quite a number of them that are quite a bit skinnier, much thinner, probably much younger. Give these guys a little time to squirm out of view, and I'll clean up a few things here as we get ready to feed the next bin. Okay, before we pack up here, did we forget anything? I don't think so. I think we're good to go. Let's just restore these coverings. Get this thing back up on the shelf. Try to remember now, what's the age of this bin? It is my newest bin. Alright, how's that? Getting my clean hand dirty. Okay. Definitely like how these plastic sheets are keeping the moisture in the bin, making the environment really cozy for the worms, making for a real productive environment. Moving on. Now the thing with this bin, the second oldest of my bins, it's really full. It's got a lot of material in it. It comes almost right up to the top surface. And besides that, it was also populated with huge number of worms. So it's also a very busy and productive bin too. It too is fairly young, just like the last bin we fed. Although offhand I can't remember how many days. Nowadays, with this moisture recirculating and the plastic over the top, any papers that I place over the feeding zones usually end up looking like this. These start out as a full coffee filter, and within 1 or 2 feedings it just gets shredded. Any paper just gets gobbled up. So I keep trying to put it back as a single sheet of paper as best I can for as long as I can. But at some point I generally have to kind of give up and come to the realization that the stuff is really no more than bedding anymore. And with this stuff, I'm wondering if we're going to end up just dropping it underneath the food in the feeding zone, or should we hang on to it? Super fragile, but still able to hang and withhold its own weight. So maybe it's still strong enough to live on another feeding as top covering. I'm very limited here. In order to make room for this next feeding, I'm almost at the top edge here, so I've got to be careful. I don't want to spill all this stuff out onto the table. So we'll just dig a shallow pit. Make room for this next application of food. My fingers keep bumping into some really large bits down here. I just don't really recall what the last feeding was. What am I hitting? The heck? Oh. This is still the pumpkin stem. That was a bit of a surprise. There must be something really delicious there that these worms have come together for. I guess it's this piece of banana peel. So, very popular item, it seems. It's odd, though. They were really drawn to that one banana peel, but why not the other one? It must reach some sort of a perfect fermented age or something. Maybe it's like a fine wine. It gets to its perfect consumption age, and then everybody goes for it. All right, we've got lots and lots of worms in here, and very little remaining space. So we're going to enter this. So we'll put this next feeding in here, but I believe it is almost time to start thinking about what to do in terms of dealing with the space constraint. I'm in here putting the food in already, but I thought we had talked about placing material under the food as bedding. So before we give them handful number 2, let's not forget to give them this cardboard we promised. So with this bin, we have the option, I guess, to relocate it into a larger tub. I've got larger tubs. This is among my smaller sized tubs. But then there's all, we could always just kind of pretend, hey, we don't have a bigger tub. What do? We got to bring closure to this. We can't keep adding food. We're out of space. So I definitely like the idea of maybe starting to starve this bin. So rather than putting it out here along with the other 2 tubs and giving it food, because they've got room, maybe we just start to say, hey, you're out of room, you got to finish what you got, and we'll move you into a fresh bin. So maybe that'll be the next phase for this. This might be just a really quick turnaround tub. Despite the fact that it's really young, it just feels like it's, blazing away to the finish line. This material is just really nice castings through and through. All right, what do you say? What do we do with this stuff? Try to cover up with it again? Yeah, let's give that a try. However, this piece of coffee filter that was serving the purpose of feeding zone indicator, I think its days are done. Turning it to bedding now. So wow, what an awesome bin. If I had a certain objective, like super quick turnaround, I need a batch of vermicompost, obviously you could do that with a very, very large number of worms, and this bin is populated with a very, very large number of worms. And I believe for the first time I'm really getting a chance to witness the speed at which they can just, gobble up a fairly large amount of food in a short period of time and produce really beautiful castings in the process. It's really fun, having a bin that's so heavily populated and works so quickly. Just crazy to see the results you get. So the only thing I'm really doing here is sort of picking off some of these larger objects off the top surface. I'm sure over time they'll get consumed, no problem. I think putting them in the middle, right over where the food's at, gives them maybe even a little better chance at getting nice and broken down. So I'm just taking this as an opportunity to move larger stuff in over the food area in the hopes that it gets broken down. The only thing is these stems. These stems seem to take forever. I just wonder if we start starving this bin, how long those sticks and stems would take, because eventually they'll just end up with nothing else to eat and they'll have to eat that. So that would be a pretty cool next step, since we are still chock full of little sticks and stems from the leaves that we used as bedding previously. Okay, how does that look? Beautiful, right? I think we'll have no problem identifying that as the feeding zone next time we get here. Although the main reason we indicate where we last fed was because it's information that you're going to use when it comes time to make a decision on where you're going to feed the next time. I'm not so sure we're going to be feeding all that much going forward. I believe that the next steps for this bin is going to be seeing how long it takes to get us to the finish and really have a batch that we can think about harvesting and figure out how to harvest what will be the most efficient approach to take. So some food for thought, but I believe this will probably be the last feeding for this bin, and we'll treat it as not to be moved into a larger container, but rather steered towards completion. Who knows? Maybe it'll be the shortest turnaround bin that I've ever had in my worming career. All right, on to the last tub. Okay, now the most mature of these bins is in the most tattered of my tubs. You can see this thing was cracking, and I tried to hold it together with some tie wraps. It's not doing a very good job. Just cracking around. So I don't even hold it by that anymore. Otherwise, I'll end up with a floor covered with worm castings. This, like the last bin, is also one that was built with a tremendous number of worms. So it too is a very productive bin. Also one that I think we can produce really quick turnarounds with. However, for whatever reason, this bin still has a fair bit of space in it, as you can tell. There's still quite a bit of sidewall left here, and these bins are basically the same size. I've got my larger, deeper tubs, like the ones that we saw the finished castings in at the beginning, but these active bins of mine, I decided I was going to try running them all out of my shallower tubs this time and try to just deal with the constraints of less space. I'm still trying to get used to having this plastic covering. It's such a treat to look inside of a bin and just see it all covered in nice, damp, fresh castings with worms hanging out, socializing on top. It really is nice. And I'm just taking a slightly slower pace now because I did notice during my last video where I was poking around and just finding cocoons and checking them out and lining them up. Kind of went off on a little cocoon tangent, but I did notice that if I just slow down, then I really do start to see more and more cocoons just by having slowed down. And maybe it was just a coincidence that time. Maybe there were just a huge number of cocoons around, because here again I feel like I've slowed down a bit, but I don't see any cocoons. All right, maybe I see one right there, maybe one right there. So once again, I find myself in here entertaining myself with these creatures, which makes you wonder, are these pets or are they really just here kind of serving a utility purpose? I've always really tried my best to consider them as just part of my composting system, and They're almost like if I was brewing beer. They're my yeast, or something like that. Yeast is a living organism, but you don't connect with it. You don't treat your yeast as so cool because of, hey, once I feed it, I'm going to have such cool bread. They're going to be so happy. So you don't treat your yeast as a pet, and I try to treat the worms in my wormery very similar to that. So just as kind of a mass, as kind of a mass organism, serving its own purpose, but also at the same time doing stuff that helps me too. So one hand washing the other, if you will. Finding little bits and pieces of the bedding we threw in here last time, but not many signs of the food. So like I said before, super hungry, busy bin. This one is. That's for sure. But it's usually fun when you find an old scrap of food where there's tons and tons of worms hanging around on it. And that's kind of what I was fishing around for. I thought we might find some real luscious piece of food that they're all teaming up on together. We might find a little bunch of worms to admire there for a moment. So what do we have here? What are they enjoying so much? Don't even know. Banana? Would I have given them this much banana? Usually they only get banana peels. But I don't remember. I can't remember what I fed them last time, so who knows. Alright, well, I'm not going to excavate all these older food items out like we did in the past to examine them. I think we'll just leave the mango pits and the banana peels right where they are, and we'll just add today's feeding right on top of the peach pit. One more time, a nice helping of fresh bedding. And even though it seems like a bit much, I came down here to feed and I've got this much left, so why don't we just see what we can do in terms of possibly overloading them, but definitely giving them more than just 2 handfuls. Let's see how much we got here. Holy cow, okay. Am I worried? Not in the least. I'm sure these worms are going to go berserk for this. It's all very thin shavings of vegetables that were peeled for being thrown into soup, carrot peels, and you name it. Here's a banana peel, maybe even 2 banana peels. Get this thing spread out across the feeding zone. Very, very generous feeding. Makes me wonder if they need coffee. Because with the coffee too, I've hardly used anything that I bought down here. If we give them the whole thing, that's a huge amount of food. So I think what we're going to do is we'll apply some grit. And I just don't remember now. Did I add grit at the last feeding? I'm a little bit of a scatterbrain and I miss steps sometimes. But it's certainly not the end of the world because I give them plenty of grit. I don't have to go back and correct a misstep. It's vermicomposting. You don't have to go too crazy sweating all the details. As long as you're somewhere in the ballpark, the worms are going to appreciate the food. They're going to dig in and enjoy it. And there's probably plenty of grit remaining in here from previous feedings. Let's just do a little bit of a debris collection across the top surface. And then also do a little bit of cleanup on this side too. Really beautiful material. Another bin that just seems like if we wanted to, we could probably just drive it towards completion at some point very soon. And if it wasn't for the need to get rid of all my kitchen scraps on a pretty regular basis, I'd be all for just letting these things starve for a while. I just feel like a bin like this, even though the material in it could probably be finished casting soon, I feel more inclined to want to use the remaining space in this bin and press on with it. So this one I believe is going to continue on, but the other bin is just out of space and we're going to try driving that to completion. So I think that's going to be the next steps. Before we part though, I just wanted to comment on the fact that now that I've disrupted everything here, all of a sudden now I'm seeing all the cocoons just everywhere, scattered all throughout the material. I mean, they're just littering the top, cocoon, cocoon, cocoon. A cocoon, 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 cocoon. They're all like just little tiny pearls of various colors. Light color ones, ones that were fairly recently deposited in here, fairly dark colored ones, ones that are probably on the verge of hatching. So I believe in the future, if I go looking for cocoons, the first step would probably be to kind of till up the top surface of the material, and that'll reveal all of the cocoons that are in the material. And this material's got plenty of them. They're everywhere. It's awesome. All right, everyone, let's get this project done here. It really has turned into a project. I thought it was going to just be a quick in and out, and once again, I was wrong. On that topic, I'm always wrong somehow, because I always think I'm going to be able to get this done 1, 2, 3, and I probably could if I wasn't the curious type, but I always find myself wanting to check out what's going on and really get a good handle on what's happening here. And I always feel like I'm learning something new, so it's really interesting. No, I don't think they're pets. I'm not going to start treating my worms as pets, and I just want to continue really using them the way I do, which is, you know, as a mass, as a whole, as a unit, as, you know, a population that can serve my purposes by doing X, Y, Z for me, as long as I reciprocate and give them what they need. So great job, everyone. Thanks for sticking with me. I appreciate the company. If you enjoyed the video, I hope you did, please remember to give me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you're interested in subscribing, you could do so by hitting the subscribe button, but also hitting the bell. That'll let YouTube know that you want to know when I've got new stuff online. You'll get notified, so you could tune in and check it out right away. All right, everyone, thanks so much for keeping me company, and thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye-bye.